It's a bitter cold morning in March 1926. A physics professor stands in a Massachusetts cabbage field, surrounded by snow and skepticism. He's about to change everything. The contraption beside him looks absurd. A tangle of pipes and tanks that his colleagues call ridiculous. The newspapers call him the Moon Man, but Robert Goddard calls it the future. Today, on the centennial anniversary of that moment, we tell the story of how 2.5 seconds changed the course of human history. What would you do if the most prestigious newspaper in America published an editorial saying you lacked the knowledge of a high school student? That you were fundamentally ignorant of basic physics? In January 1920, that's exactly what the New York Times did to Robert Goddard. They mocked his theories about rocket propulsion in space as embarrassingly wrong. The Times wouldn't print a correction until July 17, 1969, 49 years later, the day after Apollo 11 launched for the moon. This is the story of a man who was right when everyone said he was wrong, whose 2.5-second flight contained the seeds of every rocket that followed. And it begins not in a laboratory, but in a cherry tree. October 19, 1899. Worcester, Massachusetts. A 17-year-old boy named Robert Goddard climbs into the branches of a cherry tree behind his aunt's house, tasked with pruning dead limbs. He pauses, looks up at the October sky, and in that moment, something happens that he will remember for the rest of his life. Goddard later wrote that he imagined a device that could travel to Mars. He came down from that tree a different person, devoted to making space travel real. This wasn't idle daydreaming. Goddard had recently read H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, and the story had ignited something in his imagination that would never go out. He would celebrate October 19th as his personal anniversary for the rest of his life. He called it Anniversary Day, the day his vision was born. But turning that vision into reality would require solving a problem that had stumped inventors for centuries. How do you propel something through the vacuum of space? The answer was liquid fuel. Unlike solid rockets that burn uncontrollably, liquid propellants could be precisely mixed and throttled. They could be stopped and restarted. But liquid-fueled rockets existed only on paper. No one had ever built one that actually worked. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. Goddard enrolled at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, then earned his doctorate in physics at Clark University. By 1914, he had registered his first patents for rocket technology. Those 1914 patents covered multi-stage rockets and liquid propellants, technologies that would eventually power every moon rocket and space shuttle ever built. Goddard wasn't working with government funding or a large team. He was a professor at a small university, conducting experiments in the physics building basement, often alone. The Smithsonian Institution recognized his potential, providing modest grants to continue his research. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to keep his dream alive. In 1919, the Smithsonian published Goddard's paper, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. It outlined his theories about rocket propulsion, including the possibility of reaching the moon. The paper was meant for scientists, but when newspapers picked up the moon angle, Goddard's life changed forever, and not for the better. In January 1920, the New York Times published its infamous editorial. The paper stated that Goddard seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. The Times specifically attacked his understanding of Newton's third law, claiming rockets couldn't work in the vacuum of space because there was nothing to push against. This was, of course, completely wrong. Rockets don't push against air, they push against their own exhaust. It's basic physics, but the damage was done. Goddard retreated from public view. He later wrote, "In self-defense, I have to fight shy of the newspapermen." The ridicule pushed him towards secrecy, a choice that would have complicated consequences for the future of American rocketry. But it also fueled his determination. He would prove them wrong. Not with words, but with results. He just needed his rocket to fly. For years, Goddard experimented, failed, rebuilt, and tried again. Fuel mixtures exploded. Valves froze. Guidance systems didn't guide. Each failure taught him something new. By early 1926, he believed he had solved enough problems to attempt an actual flight. He found a launch site, a farm owned by a distant relative in Auburn, Massachusetts. March 16, 1926. The temperature hovered near freezing. Goddard, his wife Esther, and assistant Henry Sachs gathered in the snow-covered field with their improbable machine. The rocket was 10 feet tall, powered by liquid oxygen and gasoline. It sat in a launch frame made of metal pipes, looking more like plumbing than the future of human spaceflight. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Goddard ignited the engine. The rocket lifted off its frame with a roar, trailing flame and vapor into the gray New England sky. It flew for 2.5 seconds. It reached an altitude of 41 feet. It traveled 184 feet across the frozen cabbage patch, and then it crashed into the frozen ground, its brief flight over. But in those 2.5 seconds, something profound had happened. For the first time in history, a liquid-fueled rocket had left the ground under its own power. The fundamental technology that would take humans to the moon had been proven. No newspaper covered the event. Not the local Worcester papers, not the New York Times that had mocked him 6 years earlier. The world simply didn't notice. Goddard preferred it that way. He had learned his lesson about publicity. He documented the flight in his notebooks and continued working. He would spend the next 2 decades refining his designs, launching rockets that flew higher and higher. His later rockets would reach altitudes of 9,000 feet. In 1929, another test flight attracted unwanted attention. This time, a local newspaper did take notice, but not in the way Goddard would have hoped. A Worcester newspaper ran the mocking headline, "Moon rocket misses target by 238,799.5 miles." The ridicule continued, even as his rockets flew higher. But not everyone was laughing. One person who took Goddard very seriously was a young aviator who had just become the most famous person in the world. Charles Lindbergh, fresh from his solo transatlantic flight, read about Goddard's work and arranged a meeting. He recognized a kindred spirit, someone reaching for the impossible. Lindbergh helped Goddard secure substantial funding from the Guggenheim family. With real resources at last, Goddard could finally pursue his work properly. In 1930, Goddard relocated to Roswell, New Mexico, a remote location where he could conduct larger tests without interference from curious neighbors or mocking journalists. For the next 11 years, the New Mexico desert became his laboratory. His rockets grew larger, more sophisticated, more capable. By 1941, Goddard's rockets incorporated technologies still used today: gyroscopic stabilization, vane-controlled thrust, turbopumps, and regenerative cooling for engine nozzles. Over his lifetime, Goddard registered 214 patents covering virtually every fundamental aspect of modern rocket design. He was building the future one invention at a time. But Goddard's secretive nature meant his work remained largely unknown to other American researchers. He published little and shared less. Meanwhile, in Germany, rocket researchers were working with government support and open collaboration. They were building on ideas Goddard had patented, sometimes directly, sometimes independently. The German program would eventually produce the V-2 rocket, a devastating weapon that also proved large-scale rocket flight was possible. After World War II, American investigators examining captured V-2 rockets found multiple features matching Goddard's patents. The connection was unmistakable. Wernher von Braun, the German engineer who later developed the Saturn V for NASA, acknowledged the debt. He said Goddard's rockets blazed the trail for everything that followed. Von Braun specifically noted that while Goddard's rockets may have been rather crude by present-day standards, they incorporated many features used in our most modern rockets and space vehicles. But Goddard never lived to see this vindication. On August 10, 1945, just days after atomic bombs ended World War II, he died of throat cancer at age 62. He died believing his work had been a failure. The space age he had dreamed of since that October afternoon in the cherry tree seemed no closer than ever. He never saw the first satellite reach orbit, never saw a human leave Earth's atmosphere, never saw footprints on the moon. But others remembered. On May 1, 1959, NASA named its new space research facility in Greenbelt, Maryland, the Goddard Space Flight Center. It was the first major NASA facility to be named after a person, a fitting tribute to the man who had started it all in a Massachusetts cabbage field. Goddard's widow Esther received a $1 million settlement from the government in 1960, payment for the use of his patents in American rocket programs. And then came the ultimate vindication, the moment that proved the man the newspapers had mocked was right all along. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched for the moon. 3 astronauts rode a Saturn V rocket built on principles Robert Goddard had proven 43 years earlier. The next day, July 17, 1969, the New York Times published a brief correction. They admitted their 1920 editorial had been wrong about rocket propulsion in a vacuum. The Times wrote that further investigation and experimentation had confirmed that rockets do indeed work in a vacuum. The Times regrets the error. 49 years. That's how long it took for a simple acknowledgement that Goddard had been right, that basic physics worked exactly as he had always said. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. The dream that had seemed so absurd in 1920 had become reality. Every rocket that launches from Earth, every satellite, every space station supply mission, every Mars rover, carries Goddard's DNA. SpaceX's Falcon rockets use liquid oxygen and kerosene, direct descendants of Goddard's liquid oxygen and gasoline combination. The fuel has been refined, but the principle remains. The gyroscopic guidance systems that keep rockets stable, the turbopumps that feed fuel to engines, the multi-stage designs that shed weight as they climb, all Goddard innovations. He was right about everything. Rockets do work in a vacuum. Liquid fuel is the key to controlled spaceflight. And yes, humans can reach the moon. So what can we learn from Robert Goddard, a century after his first successful flight? His story offers lessons that extend far beyond rockets and physics. First, the experts are sometimes wrong. The New York Times editorial board in 1920 included some of the most educated people in America. They were confidently, publicly, spectacularly incorrect. Goddard himself put it best. Every vision is a joke until the first man accomplishes it. Once realized, it becomes commonplace. Second, public ridicule can wound, but it doesn't have to define you. Goddard was deeply hurt by the mockery. He retreated from public view, but he never stopped working. His response to critics wasn't anger or defense, it was results. He let his rockets speak for him, climbing higher and higher and higher into the New Mexico sky. Third, some vindication comes too late to enjoy. Goddard died believing he had failed. He never knew how completely his vision would triumph. This raises uncomfortable questions for our own time. Whose ideas are we mocking today that will seem obvious a century from now? The history of innovation is littered with people who were right when everyone said they were wrong, and with experts who were certain about things that turned out to be false. Goddard also said, "It is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." March 16, 2026, marks the centennial of Goddard's first flight. Consider using this anniversary as a moment of reflection on persistence and vision. If you're near Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum houses several of Goddard's original rockets and equipment. Seeing them in person is remarkable. Or simply step outside on a clear night and watch the International Space Station pass overhead. It's visible to the naked eye, and it's there because of what happened in that cabbage field. There's something profound about that connection. The straight line from a professor's frozen field to astronauts living and working in orbit. Goddard understood this connection intuitively. That's why he climbed the cherry tree every October 19th until he couldn't anymore. He knew where the dream began. And he knew it was bigger than him. That the vision he'd glimpsed as a 17-year-old would outlast his lifetime and reshape human history. Robert Goddard's first rocket flew for 2.5 seconds. It reached 41 feet. No one noticed, except the 3 people standing in that frozen field. But those 2.5 seconds contained everything that followed. the satellites that connect our world, the rovers that explore Mars, the space stations that orbit overhead. The Moon Man was right. And 100 years later, his dream carries humanity toward stars he could only imagine. What dreams do we hold today that seem impossible? What visions will take a century to prove? Goddard would tell us, keep climbing, keep building. The sky was never the limit.